Today, for our Science ACT overview, we're going to look at data representation passages. We're going to start first by talking about what to expect when we see a data representation passage, refresh what kind of questions we're looking for, and work our way through an actual passage from a previous ACT. Remember that there are 3 data representation passages on the Science ACT. These passages contain specific information in the form of graphs, tables, and charts. There are several questions that you might see, but your questions might ask you to draw conclusions from the information given, to determine the relationship between data sets or to recognize trends, to interpolate, or to predict an answer between points, or extrapolate to find a point beyond the data set, or simply just to locate information on the graph. Before we go on, let's review the 5 types of questions that we may come across. Our first type of question is a detail question. These questions will ask you to find a specific point on the graph. Our second type is a pattern question. These will ask you to predict a trend. These are our extrapolation and interpolation questions. An inference question will ask you to draw conclusions about the data that you see presented to you. Scientific method questions will ask you to consider the experiment itself and its design. Remember that there are only 1 to 3 scientific method questions on the entire test. The 5th and final type of question is the compare and contrast questions, but you will not see any of these in this type of passage because this is not a conflicting viewpoints passage. Before we begin, remember that you're trying to gather as much information as you can as quickly as possible. So as you skim through the passage and read over your graphs, try and figure out what this passage is about and why they did this experiment. Alright, here's an example passage. A scientist wanted to observe the effects of altitude on the respiratory system of mammals. 4 different species of mammals were placed in a chamber that underwent gradual changes in pressure, measured in atmospheres, or ATM, to simulate the atmosphere at high altitudes. After 5 minutes at each atmospheric pressure tested, the average number of breaths per minute, or respiratory rate, was determined for each of the 4 mammals, while they remained at rest. The data from the experiment are shown in the following graph. Note, larger animals typically have slower respiratory rates. Higher respiratory rates indicate rapid breathing, a sign of distress in some mammals. Here in the lower right-hand corner is the figure that's attached with this passage, or here, a much larger figure to look at. Before we look at the questions, let's take a minute to look at this graph and see what information we can quickly gather. Notice here off to the left, I have the respiratory rate on my y-axis. Down below, I have the atmospheric conditions on my x-axis. Pay very close attention to the numbers on the x-axis. Notice that they are decreasing. This is something that you don't often see with graphs of this nature, but is something that you should pay very close attention to because it may come in handy later. Alright, here is question 1. What is the relationship between respiratory rate and atmospheric pressure for mammal 2? Before you read any of the answer choices, I want you to decide what type of question this is. This is a pattern question. That should be made obvious by the word relationship. When you see the word relationship, it is generally asking you to find a trend. Notice here, I'm looking at mammal 2, and as my atmospheric conditions decrease, I see my respiratory rate increase. Remember before how we said that those numbers went down and that they may come in handy? Here's where they're coming in handy. As my atmospheric conditions decrease, my respiratory rate increases, leading us to answer choice G. If you weren't paying attention, you might choose answer choice J because you saw an upward trend, assuming that there was an increase in both. Remember, pay very close attention to those numbers. Question 2. At approximately which pressure in atmospheres did mammals 2 and 3 have the same respiratory rate? What type of question is this? This is a details question. This question is asking me to find a point on the graph where the lines for mammals 2 and 3 cross. If I look at my chart, I can see that that cross happens right here at a pressure of 0.80 atmospheres. So when I come back to my question, which pressure in atmospheres did they have the same respiratory rate, I can find my answer simply. Answer choice C. This is the easiest type of question on the Science ACT and does not require you to even read the passage at all. Question 3. Further measurements showed that mammal 4 used significantly more oxygen per minute than mammal 2. This would be consistent with the data from the graph if. This is a little bit of a harder question. It's asking you to draw conclusions based off of the information that you got, therefore making it an inference question. If we look at the graph, we notice that mammal 2 has a much higher respiratory rate than mammal 4. The only way that this could be possible and mammal 4 still get more oxygen is if mammal 4 were taking in more oxygen for every breath. The way that mammal 4 could take in more oxygen for every breath is if it were a bigger animal. If we come back to our answer choices, we can see that answer choice G states that it would have to be significantly larger than mammal 2. Remember that this is a little bit more of a difficult kind of question because it's asking you to look at the graph, go back to the passage, and to look at your answer choices to find the best answer. Remember, always read every answer choice. Question 4. A higher respiratory rate causes mammals to have a higher metabolic rate. Which of the mammals would have a higher metabolic rate at a pressure of 1 atmosphere than at 0.8 atmospheres? This is a pattern question. It's asking you to compare two mammals at two different pressures. I'm looking for pressures that are higher at 1 atmosphere than they are at 0.8 atmospheres. Right away, we can see that mammal 1 has a respiratory rate of about 40 breaths per minute at 1 atmosphere and maybe 35 breaths per minute at 0.8 atmospheres. A very, very obvious pattern. However, less obvious and a little bit harder to see is the respiratory rate of mammal 4, where it may have 8 breaths per minute at 1 atmosphere and possibly 6 or 7 breaths per minute at 0.8 atmospheres. While the first trend is easy to see, the second one is not as easy to see. Don't worry, you are allowed to write in your ACT booklet. If you need to, draw lines on the graph to make sure that you're picking up all of these trends. Now, back to the question. Notice that you have 1 only as an answer choice and 4 only as an answer choice. The correct answer is D, 1 and 4. This is another example of why you need to really pay attention to reading all of the answer choices, because if you only read A, you would get this answer choice wrong. Our fifth and final question. Based on the data in the graph, which of the mammals might be native to high altitude environments, meaning that they are more comfortable at higher altitudes than at lower altitudes? This again is an inference question. Now, you may be a little confused because this whole passage we've been talking about pressure and respiratory rate. But if you go back to the passage, we're talking about the effects of altitude by changing pressure, right? The Science ACT also expects you to know one very important fact, that at higher altitudes there is lower pressure. It's one of the few things that the Science ACT expects you to know before you come into the test. So, if we look back at our chart, we should be looking for a mammal that has a consistently lower respiratory rate at lower atmospheric conditions. Here we see that mammal 4 fits that bill. If we go back to our question and our answer choices, we can see that the answer choice is J. That's all that we have for today. Tomorrow, we will look at research summaries questions.